Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and this week we have a guest whose name probably always belonged in the Garden of Doom, and that is the Cleric of Chaos. I mean, every Garden of Doom needs a Cleric of Chaos. So Cleric is emanating to us from Berlin, though spends a lot of time in Canada and the United States as well, because they, it's like the Borg Collective, there's more than one soul in there, is a performer. But I will let the Cleric explain the Cleric to you, and then we'll get back to it. So, Cleric, please, first of all, thank you for coming to the Garden of Doom and giving us your Holy Spirit, and tell the folks a little bit about you.
Well, first and foremost, Jeff, thank you so very much for having me today. And hello, willkommen, mein Freund, in North America and anywhere and everywhere everyone is listening. Now, you are correct. A Garden of Doom may or may not require a Cleric of Chaos, and I just so happen to have my utility tools ready for a heated discussion about some of our most favorite aspects of ancient aliens and Nephilim.
Yes, I'm very excited because the Cleric, you may detect a little bit of a Canadian accent, and that is accurate as well, but does spend most of their time in Berlin, Germany. I think you're our first guest from Berlin, from Germany, period, which is cool. I do, at the end of the year, I sort of try to do a mock-up and see where the guests are from and break them down by all sorts of census-based materials that nobody except me cares about. But that's sort of the basis of the show, right? And you hope people care about it. So, but he sort of tipped the lead. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about a lot of things Nephilim related. Obviously, one of the forefathers is the wrong word, but inspirations for the show is, as longtime listeners know, is the Nephilim. But it's not just Nephilim. It's going to be all sorts of European, Eastern European folklore, myths, legends, spooky stuff. Maybe we're going to get into some Slavic stuff. Who knows? I don't know. The Cleric is a wealth of information, which of course, one body with several vessels in them should be, because you have that much more brain power to put towards it. So, Cleric, as we exchange, you're going to lead the dance, and I will be an active participant, try not to step on any toes.
Outstanding. Well, it's been a minute or two since I practiced my waltz or my minuet, but I will absolutely give it every single shot that I can.
Nice.
Graciousness and gratitude are often overlooked when it comes to media, when it comes to joining one in a situation like this. So, formally, I wish to thank you. I wish to express my gratitude and my appreciation We have tried to set this up a couple times over the past few months, but I have had schedule conflicts, and that is completely on me. But to begin, you are absolutely correct. There is a very strong Canadian accent within the parameters of my voice. I was indeed born in Canada. Not to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, but I think it is kind of obvious to anybody who has spoken to me for more than a couple of moments that there is a fair bit of country and creativity up in about their head. So when it comes down to what we're discussing today, once again, Jeff has graciously invited me on to discuss the Nephilim, as well as a couple of other different small topics. And I'd like to start off just by identifying that both you and I, we are strong advocates, if you want to call it that, and firm believers in different forms of ideology, different levels of not even just the Nephilim, but different ideological concepts and constructs when it comes to how the origin of man or the origin of life began on this pale blue sphere that we all dwell on. In the beginning, even in Genesis and in figurative and metaphorical versus literal translations and explanations, Nephilim is essentially giant entity, giant man, giant woman. Basically, when we look at the various examples over the course of time, both literal and figurative, we have been graced enough to understand that there is a lot of Anunnaki information, as well as a lot of, let's just say, evidence, if you want to call it that, depending on what you would categorize as being a physical representation of evidence or not. As you were indicating, there is a lot of Slavic lore when it comes to the Nephilim, as well as to how it applies to the former USSR, and even how it applies currently to President Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
When you look into specifically the Balkan states and the areas in and around there, like your Romanias, your Hungaries, your Bucharest, Bucharest is a city, but the one thing remains the same. There are differences in the names, there are differences in the times, there are differences in the explanation, but what remains static across the board is that each and every single one of these cultures, whether they be Gypsy cultures, whether they be Scandinavian cultures, whether they even be early Esk-Germanic, or whether they be Swiss Germanic, Bavarian, so on and so forth, we all have our boogeyman. We all have our big scary man in the closet, so to speak. This is more of a benevolent and a more of a, let's just say, a beneficial existence and a beneficial kind of addition to our lore as people. You look back at the Ottoman Empire, you look back at the Holy Roman Empire, and you look back at stories that were taken to teach people lessons, that were taken to try to make people built into better characters. The Nephilim, for lack of a better term, at least in a lot of Holy Roman Empire texts and a lot of references, have been used more sporadically than what you would see in like a reserve museum in Romania. Right. What you would see in an architectural exhibit east of Greece. There are so many different examples. And I'd like to basically start by going into a Bible verse, just to kind of further identify specifically exactly what even 2,000, 2,500 years ago people were thinking. And it's Numbers 13-32 to 33. And it's, so they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw the Nephilim. The Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And for lack of a better term, what that identifies and what that explains is the writer in said situation is merely positing that, wow, this entity of such vast size and girth and absolutely, completely ginormous proportions to everything, this could not be possible, but we seem to them as we are grasshoppers. So even dating back into the most basic of the King James Version Bibles, looking back into Roman further follow-ups and edits, that text is still there. It's not edited. It comes across entirely the same. So when you take that into, let's just try to say perspective, because it was written 3,000 years ago, right? When you take that into kind of just trying to compartmentalize and put forth an idea or notion as to what that could mean or translate to, it means that there are a bunch of giant scary dudes and or ladies in skeletonized form in which these individuals are now uncovering. We are now excavating these things. And going back 50, 60 years, a lot of European architects, there was a lot of concern, a lot of worry. And I'm fairly sure that you've heard that there were scandals, individuals who were making things up in order to get to a point to where they would receive fame, money, so on and so forth.
Sure.
And then once they were revealed to be lies, you never heard from them in the architectural or the archaeological community ever again. So when we take into consideration the examples from Scandinavian and Slavic lore, there are a lot of equivalencies between the Russian sleep experiment, which is a creepypasta from years and years ago, which is basically just a story that somebody wrote about a bunch of people who were put into a federal test facility and deprived of sleep for a certain period of time. Those particular stories, combined with the Nephilim, as well as combined with the giants of entities in Slavic folklore, that creepypasta was essentially their way of putting forth a notion that these beings were in a lab. These beings escaped the lab. And the sleep experiment wasn't in any way, shape, or form about sleep. It was about controlling these entities to understand what their powers were, to understand why they're 30 feet tall, to understand how and why they come to our planet to do as they wish. But in terms of circumstances, as well as in terms of exact direct examples, if you look back to the most previous Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, she has come out and said on a couple of different points, very, very, let's just say, coyly, if that is a word. I don't think it is, but very, very kind of silently, almost making you ask more. She alluded to archaeological excavations yielding results that were not seen in Germany for decades upon decades upon decades. Most specifically, when they were excavating areas that were close to Leipzig and close to Munich and Frankfurt am Main, there were a lot of unidentified skeletal remains that they're still trying to figure out and ultimately determine as to whether or not they are human, Nephilim, or animal. But in that particular specific circumstance, she did something that no German ever really does and broke logic. She ultimately admitted to identifying that there is a possibility that these are what people think they are. We need to be open-minded, we need to understand, we need to do this, and we need to do that. So when you take that particular example and you combine it with everything that we see in current media, your Godzilla -1 that just came out, more Godzilla movies that are coming out, more big, scary, spooky horror movies, a lot of them find their root base in the origins of the giants or in the Nephilim stories.
Comic books, too.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many book examples, and you and I, we're pretty avid readers, I think. I think you read probably, a book every 2 weeks, maybe a book a week, probably.
If you count listening to books, probably more than that, yes.
I definitely count it. It absolutely does count. But when you take into context how much you read, you've read a lot about this type of content. You've read a lot about Scandinavian as well as just Slavic folklore. You're very, very into those things. But when it comes to how you and someone like me, when we read these types of pieces of information, we jump into the world of its own. We immerse ourselves in it. We're not just there just to read it, extrapolate information, put it on a piece of paper, and go on our way. We're very, very happy with what we do when it comes to the material that we review and having the opportunity to be interested in things like this.
Actually, an interesting footnote to that, or aside, is that you're right, that's how it used to be, but this show has made that impossible for me now. Now it's like I find myself lost in finding connections everywhere, and then I realize I've just looked at the words for 10 pages and have to go back.
No, that's totally relatable, especially when you're doing 3,000 different things at once, like you generally have a tendency to do. The time for physical reading or the time to, really, really inundate yourself in a book, it kind of doesn't really have that same feel anymore, or you don't have the same capability that you once did. But identifying specifics in what our interests are in folklore, the whole idea of ancient aliens and the Nephilim, I'm not gonna say emphatically that there's a lot of Germanic folklore that you don't already know or that you're not already aware of, because quite a few podcasts of yours have delved into very, very, very significant discussions with respect to European as well as Asian kind of inspirations for things, as well as what people's opinions are. So I'm not going to bash your listeners over the head with, on this date and on this time, it was discovered and identified that in the city of Munich, there was a gentleman in whom discovered a skull that was 4 times the size of his own vessel.
Right.
No, I'm not going to put you guys through that. But simultaneously, when we're looking at the differences and comparisons between ancient and modern times, there are still some similarities that we also, again, we look to the Bible to. Ezekiel 32:27 is, "And they do not lie with the fallen warriors of long ago, who went down to Sheol with their weapons of war, whose swords were laid under their heads, and whose shields are upon their bones. For the terror of the warriors was in the land of the living." Perfect state for our entire existence right now, isn't it? The land of the living is awfully terrifying. Absolutely. But putting that into context with respect to Germanic folklore, as well as putting it into association with the ancient landscapes and archetypes, the idea that these were, for lack of better term, projects, like, you know how the quote-unquote, the covert CIA projects of creating a super warrior or creating a super soldier or whatever.
Right.
There is a conglomerate? No. There is a congregation of people that feel/believe, at least from the Germanic perspective, that the Nephilim were bred specifically and intently for war, that they're not from here, that they were essentially, for lack of a better term, manufactured in a lab. Like, if you've ever seen the South Park episode, The Return of Chef, at the end where they throw him in some big giant ICU suit and he's like a metal guy now, or the Mecha Streisand episode of South Park, same ideological concept. You really, really have no way of really being able to put forth more of a direct notion that people think that, wow, these are just super soldiers, rather than just writing it down in that kind of context. But even in that Bible verse specifically, it leaves things open to interpretation. Now, as far as religious atonement or religious ideation or association go, I am not a religious man. I am an atheist. Whomever listens to this podcast and does believe in religion, you have a wealth of information that you can go back and you can read into, and a lot of stories to enjoy. But that said, you have a lot of opinions when it comes to ancient aliens overall. The very idea, the very notion that, again, we might not be from here, so on and so forth. But I kind of want to get your opinion as to how you feel let's just say that the Ezekiel verse that we just discussed there, how you feel that would apply to our current state.
I mean, first of all, I love that verse, and I think that in there, the word Sheol, probably, I'm not sure everybody's familiar with it. Honestly, a year ago, neither was I. Sheol is just the Jewish underworld, the afterlife, where Jews don't have heaven and hell. There's just Sheol, and then there's like some other places that humans don't go to. There's a talk of a place called Duatl, where Azazel was taken by, I think, Raphael in the Book of Enoch in the Angelic War. Whether or not that's a private hell or it's just a different word for Tartarus, which was the Greek word for where the Titans were below the underworld, the deepest, darkest. I don't know, but Tartarus is also mentioned in the Old Testament as well. Whether it was a translation, and this is not even what you asked me. But you can tell there's different authors to the Bible, because earlier, the first quote that you gave us used the word grasshoppers. And that's a very famous quote. But grasshoppers are the same thing as locusts. And before the Israelites came upon where they were but grasshoppers, locust was a plague. One of the plagues that allowed the Israelites to escape the Egyptian bondage, as the story goes. So why use the word locust once and the word grasshoppers later? When we're talking, I know there was 40 years of wandering and language changes, but I'm not sure that how you refer to insects would change in comparison. So, but it's interesting, the laying on the shields with their swords, that's the warrior's death. That's very similar to the Viking concept of the warrior death. It's very similar to the Assyrians and the Akkadians and the Scythians, and obviously that harkens back to much older times. As far as the state of the world, I think that there's a little bit of comfort in it, that people were always sort of terrified of existence now. There's always been chaos, Sir Cleric, or perceived chaos in the living world, and the afterlife was always sort of looked to as maybe the place for peace, even if it was Sheol, which is not really a great place. It's just, I mean, but it's not, it's like you're sort of in a fugue state. So even if it's not so great, it's sort of like that time that you're like sort of asleep but not really asleep. It ain't great, but you're you know, but it doesn't bother you either. You know, possibly that's the goal of some experiments, is to put people into, I mean, that would be the sheep state, wouldn't it? It's funny how sheep is such a negative connotation these days. Don't be sheep. You know, Jesus is the lamb. You know, there's a shepherd. I mean, we're supposed to be sheep. We're supposed to be the flock being led by someone, but like, sheep isn't supposed to be a bad thing. You know, the wolf is in sheep's clothing. The sheep's supposed to be good. And I'm not necessarily in that, you know, again, I'm getting way off track, but that's okay. We meander here. I used to say, you know, there used to be, and there still is, question authority, question everything. I'm all for questioning everything. Obviously, I have a show called Garden of Doom. We explore all sorts of things here. Some things somebody thinks are crazy. Some things other people think are crazy. Some things I think are crazy. Doesn't matter. And a lot of you think I'm crazy, and you're all right. I mean, it's all cool. But I can't. I've lost my own train of thought, Cleric.
No, it's all good. That was kind of a loaded question, and we only had 4 bullets in the 6-shooter, so you know, it was about time for a blank to be drawn.
No, but I had something good. I swear, I really did. They'll come back to me later. It's okay.
You undermine yourself. That detailed explanation, as well as those particular references, were ideal. They were very fitting. I think you're a little bit too harsh on yourself there, Morty. But,
well, it's just because I forgot something, and I don't remember if it was good or not. But the forgetting is probably more impactful to me than what was actually being said. It's, you know, I'm 55, for God's sake.
Yeah, but you know, in types of scenarios like that, like, again, you do so much, and your day is filled with so many different tasks and whatnot. Forgetting something like that is better than forgetting to close the door on the oven when you have it on. So, you know, things like that, absolutely. It's more than all right. I mean,
it's been a while since I've accidentally blew up a house.
Well, you know, as long as you're blowing up its retail value, I'm pretty sure that would be appreciated. But given the nature of circumstances, I think arson is illegal in most states, although I have to brush up on my state and federal law before I make such a sweeping accusation.
It's one of those felonies, but, I mean, it's, you know, it's not arson if you burn down your own place. It might be insurance fraud, though.
Well, you know, I mean, if you're burning down your own house, then there's probably some issues there that are probably better rooted for a psychologist. And if a psychologist can't figure it out, then maybe a corner bar with a couple of shots of brandy will be fine for you.
Or both.
But that would be even better. That would be flawless. But let's transfer slightly in terms of the topic, while also staying on the Nephilim concept. Ancient aliens, astronauts, you know, different cultures, different languages. We all have different names for them. We have different ideologies and different views and different things as to how we're shaped. There is a contingent of people, past, present, future, who believed, will believe that humans did not emanate from Earth. That, to expound upon a previous point, that the Nephilim were some of the first ancient aliens, or some of the first ancient astronauts to land on this planet, and you know, all the making love with the orifices of the earth and all that good stuff, and truly laying the groundwork and laying the proverbial road for people to discuss different possible concepts of whether or not we emanate from this planet, to discuss different ideas as to whether or not there is a species before us, the proverbial missing link that still seems to not be able to be identified on a consistent basis, and scientists can't fully agree on it yet. Maybe, just maybe, on the dark side of the moon or on the dark side of Mars, there is currently a cohabitation. Maybe in another star system, there is a a Centaurian version, a Proxima Centaurian version of humanity, where they're all wondering, hey, I wonder what's out there. But to get into that particular topic specifically, across the board, there are differences of opinion. Across the board, there are discussions, there are debates, and there are arguments. What are your thoughts and or feelings as to where humanity emanates from, and as to whether or not there are and or were ancient astronauts that visited our fair blue sphere?
Okay, indeed, that was the original question, was it not? My opinions on it, okay, I'm like Mulder. I want to believe. And I always think that there's something towards the commonality in the creation stories and the commonality of there being some sort of hybridization. And it's oftentimes, especially as you get into the more recent religions and not just the Indo-European, but it's actually surprisingly similar in what's not considered Indo-European. So, I mean, my suspicion is that from the Indo part of the European, from the Indus Valley, that some of those commonalities went east, through China and all of the, whatever those countries are called now. They were not called that then, obviously. People don't realize that the People's Republic of China is only 74 years old this year. It'll be turning 75. And to Shintoism, in Japan, these creation stories are very similar. And a lot of times, if not universally, they do involve some sort of, usually third or fourth generation of divine beings, gods or godlike creatures coming down. Now, I know that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, I'm not sure about what the Quran says on it. I'm working to get there diligently, but with mixed success. It's divine-like beings, angels. People can disagree as to whether they're, gods or not gods. I would say if you're immortal and you have special powers, that sort of, that's sort of a god to me. That's what I don't believe there actually are any monotheists out there. There's no monotheistic religions. You got a god and a devil and angels and demons. That's a panoply, my friends. That's a pantheon. But aside from that, even in the religions that it doesn't seem to have those multiple generations, often the grandchildren, usurping their parent, and the grandfather, the the grandfather, either was usurped or never really took that much, sort of did their creation part, had a few kids and sort of pieced out, like Uranus did, sort of pieced out, and Anu, in Sumerian and Indian, they're like, yeah, you guys handle it. I'm not that interested down there. But then you have the fish gods, like the Dogon tribe and the Zulu tribe of that. But also there's Mesoamerican tribes that have similar sort of mermen creatures. And it's interesting, the first depictions of Zeus, not just Poseidon, but Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were all of mermen, and they've evolved. So, it's interesting to think about all of those commonalities. There's got to be something central to it. Now, is that centrality? That's what's happened? That starmen came from the sky, and some of them were aquatic, they were amphibious, or in that, or they were different races, some reptilian, some insectile. In some languages, Anunnaki means ant people. Is that just phonetics, or is that, something that's non-coincidental? People talk about with authority all the different races that have come here. I don't know how they can speak with authority on that. Anyone can make this stuff up. But is there some basis in that this is what actually happened at some point 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago? I mean, a story like that would probably be remembered, passed down, and then you can see how it would grow. And, it would grow where you'd have pantheons and generations, of gods and things like that. The other possibility is that it's a commonality of where our culture came from, whether it was, somewhere in South or Central Africa where this story sort of took hold, and, as it and languages drifted, so did the stories, or maybe it's the more recent sort of what I call the delta of civilizations that sort of started with the Fertile Crescent on one side, the Indus Valley on another point, and sort of, you make those lines go up in a triangle and sort of end sort of in Russia with Ukraine and Kazakhstan, sort of in there where a lot of people think the Indo-European culture started. Most people think it was in the sort of the Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Eurasian steppes area. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, that's not particularly important for this discussion, whether the story started then. But I think it'd be really cool if it was real. Now, there's other scientific ideas as to, panspermia, and it very much depends on what you define panspermia as. If, asteroids, turned into meteorites and brought organic materials here that were sort of the final combinations or needed additives to create life here or to allow the conditions for life to occur. Is that panspermia? Yeah, technically it is. Could that have happened multiple times? Of course. Could have had different results? Of course. But when people say panspermia, I think most people aren't thinking. I think they're thinking more like the Anunnaki. And to go to a point you were making a while ago, the Anunnaki were absolutely an experiment. Now, in their version, it was to make a slave race to harvest gold. But if you go with what would be the result of the hybrids in, say, Greek mythology, the heroes, the giants, the great men and heroes of renown, which is the same words from the Bible about the Nephilim. I mean, then you're talking about your Achilles, your Hercules, your Theseus, your Ajax, your Odysseus. Just read Homer. Agamemnon. Everyone you've heard of was a demigod, basically. The one thing that sows a lot of the biggest seed of doubt in my mind is that it's like 99% men who came down, males who came down and procreated. There are a few out there. There's probably more I don't know about, but there are a few where it's the female that comes down, does it. Most notably Aphrodite, and we've mentioned on the show before, but the interesting thing about Aphrodite is that she's not really originally from the Greek pantheon. She was sort of imported from the East. She's not even an Olympian. She's actually a contemporary of sort of the Titans and sort of the Greek giants, which is an entirely different thing, and that were akin to gods and sort of never get mentioned again. So even there's a little asterisk next to Aphrodite. Now I know, and then she had I forgot the not Eos. It doesn't matter who it is, but and she continued her mother's sort of ways. But there's demons that do incubus and succubus, male and female, and I can't rule out that they're not from the same kind of place. But I don't know. The fact that they're so overwhelmingly male seems to me that it's more of a story than a reality, which does not rule out visitations in the least. I mean, nothing can explain to me. I mean, you can venerate your gods all you like, but some of those towers and the Nazca lines and things like that, people doing things, these enormous projects for apparently no reason, just because they venerated their gods. Do you really think that people venerated their gods so much more then than they do now? I don't. I think they would have been busier trying to survive.
Like that one meme video that has been making the waves on social media recently of that Shaolin master who's going and making speeches to colleges, universities, businesses, corporations. And he's essentially stating emphatically in no certain terms that depression is fake. Yeah. That it is a completely manifested construct of what current circumstances as well as what current economical situations have allowed the species to feel. What he is mentioning and referring to specifically as well is that back in ancient times, people didn't have time to worry about things like that. You were so focused and you were so dedicated to your own survival and the survival of your clan that there was literally no time or space for anyone to do anything like that, to feel anything like that. It was a non-factor, for lack of a better term. But to put it into current today standards, to understand that when you have a different type of thought, or when you experience a different type of situation, referring back to biblical verses or referring back to the writers of those verses themselves, whether or not those events actually transpired is neither here nor there. Neither you nor I could verify that, obviously, but how it's told matters. How different cultures tell their stories, how they share the information with the generation that comes after them is vital. I'm fairly sure that we're both familiar with the story of Babylon, how, the Tower of Babylon was originally meant to be built to reach the kingdom of heaven, but God didn't like that too much, so he made sure that nobody could understand each other, so everybody was speaking different languages. It's a very, very good, kind of a nuanced version of that in a lot of today's culture and a lot of today's society. English is ubiquitous in business around the world, but in a different timeline, it might be Mandarin. In a different timeline, it might be French. In a different timeline, it might be Italian. But the one commonality that stays is that everyone goes along and everyone toes the line because that's what the people before us have said, this is what you do.
There was always a lingua franca of kind of Australia, and sometimes it was French. That's why it's called lingua franca. But, Seleucid Greek was the lingua franca for a long time. Nobody wrote Arabic or Hebrew because they were busy with either Aramaic or Greek, and then sort of Latin took over that. But you're 100% correct about all of that, as you are about most things.
You're far too kind. You are absolutely far too kind. I mean, with respect to that, I mean, our show that we did a little while back, I didn't hit the record button, so don't be that kind to me.
It was a beta test. Beta test.
Say that again.
It was a beta test. Beta. It was the beta tests are designed to get the bumps out. And that's a pretty big bump, but it's also an easy one to correct.
Yes, just press the button next time, basically.
yeah. I mean, have a little list.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just checklists. Now you have to remember one. The first one is push record button. But yeah, there's definitely part of that. It's funny though, because the Tower of Babel story is repeated in other cultures as well, which likely had no connection to, Babylon or the Bible. Again, is it a story that is based in some type of truth? Is it a story that was based on some sort of commonality of culture where, you better learn your lesson? Or is it a, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell archetypal story that just sort of repeats itself in our brain? But I recently read, and by read, I mean listened to, a book called something like the History of Secret Wisdom. And it's by a gentleman named Mark Booth. That's not his real name, but that's his pen name. And he has agreed in principle to come on the show. We haven't booked it yet, but I'm even excited about the prospect. But whenever I start talking out loud about things like that, I usually jinx it. But I'm not going to pretend that I understood the entirety of the book, but to go to what the Shaolin monk was saying, it may sound insensitive. It may also sound, I think we romanticize the past in ways that are convenient to us in the present, that may or may not have any truth. But if you believe the different secret knowledges, and Mr. Booth indicates that he studied it for 33 years, and it's a very interesting book. It's a great listen. I don't know if it's a great read or not, but it's a great listen. Part of the secret wisdom is that as different cultures and ideologies and beliefs and figures became prominent in conjunction with astrology and astronomy, the brain actually changed. So the brain is ready to do certain things and not ready to do certain things at different times. Whether I believe it or not, I don't know, but it sort of goes in line in some ways. It's different, but could be consistent with that monk's view that when your brain chemistry changes as your life situation changes, and it may be just as simple as our diet. We put food where we are chemicals and water mostly, and so maybe there's something to it. Maybe it's not. Maybe the reason that the average age, is 32 is because there were a lot of people who were depressed and didn't make it. And then, when the mastodons were stampeding, they didn't run away quite as fast. I mean, we don't know. We don't know any of that. Shaolin monk or otherwise, he doesn't know any more about that than you and I. He knows a whole lot more about Buddhism than you and I.
100%, and especially with how he demonstrates his behavior and how he chooses his words and the cadence in which he carries. I have never seen an arrogant Shaolin monk before this man, but this man looked like he belonged in a movie about Shaolin monks. But just the amount of conviction that he was speaking with, as if, giving that talk, he was the empirical source of information on all of this. It, to me, at least in a way, shape, or form, kind of refers back to biocentrism, or, the overall study of ethics in an ecological sense. It just doesn't really fully translate with today's culture and today's society, especially when you take into consideration the amount of mental illnesses that have been validated? There we go. Validated and verified. So now people have a whole litany of things to where they can gain support from. They can access a whole litany of resources. And just for the record, if anyone listening to this is feeling a certain type of way, there are resources out there. You are loved. You are valued. You are important, and your life matters. When we look at the overall idea as to how we have shaped our thoughts and shaped our opinions all the way from ancient aliens, all the way from ancient cultures and civilizations to where we currently stand, one thing that I wrote down in my little note over here, I kind of want to get your opinion on. The Garden of Doom is an absolutely lovely place to dwell, especially when it comes to discussing topics that may or may not be considered genial to some and or controversial to others. But racism, you and I, we both have strong feelings with respect to how people are treated, the decency of man, so to speak. But in a very, very, very blunt statement / question, is it not a little bit asinine to not include, to persecute, to abhor, to just completely hate anyone and everything that doesn't share the same color of skin pigment as you? If we're literally basing these types of thoughts, these types of practices, and obviously it's been around since the dawn of time. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up, is because when we come into a situation to where we are experiencing either firsthand or we are witnessing a racial indemnity, somebody is being very blatantly, overtly racist, two thoughts occur. One, how insecure are you that you are literally picking something that somebody cannot control to pick on them for? And two, what does it say about your character if you are making a decision to do something like that? And to put it even more succinctly, frankly, it is ridiculous, for lack of a better term, that just because of where you're born and just because of the way the sun hits your skin, people are going to hate you. People aren't going to like you. Your culture is completely useless to some just because of how you look. Obviously, in Maryland, Baltimore is a up and down kind of place. I like it personally. I think it has a lot of charm. But we both know that there's been some crime there up and down. There's been some racial profiling. There's been a lot of calamity there. But more overtly and more directly, how do you feel with respect to how it is possible that we can still be a species that can't get over that? How is it possible that we are still making a sort of decision to look at somebody who may be black, white, brown, yellow, whatever, and say, I don't like you because of your color? How do you feel about that?
I find it strange in this day and age. I almost get it earlier. By earlier, I mean thousands of years ago, because otherization would be a way to have group survival and to galvanize yourself against someone else, because there was a real competition for resources. I think that it gets sillier with time. But I think there is something that's wired in us to look at the world as friend or enemy, and maybe some of the obvious things are there. That said, we should be evolved enough as a species to get over that. I don't think it's any secret unless this is the first time you're listening to this show or listening to me in any venue, my wife is Latina. I often complain how when we did our Ancestry.com or 23andMe a couple of years ago, mine came back 100% European, not even listing countries, and I wanted my money back. And she had like 21 different countries listed, but, several of them were, different types of indigenous of the Americas, North America, regional, Colombian, South Andean, this side, that side. But also she had like Benin, Sardinia, Scotland, Ireland. So many different places and regions, and all I had was 100% European with a giant circle, basically, stopping somewhere. Well, starting basically where you live, Germany, going basically into, the European part of Russia, a circle, and just cutting off the bottom of Greece, Italy, and basically making its way into France. So, just a giant circle. I'm still unhappy about that, obviously. Just tell me apart Hungarian, Romanian, German, Russian, Croatian. I don't care. Give me something here. People saw some people listen are on my Facebook, and my Facebook is public. You can look at my wedding pictures and see who was there. It's, like every insurance commercial you see these days, it's a mix of everyone, shapes, sizes, colors, whatever. That's just not really how I live my life. But when threatened, I find myself being tribal too. Right now we are in the midst of, a war between Israel and Hamas. And I'm very tribal. I am accepting things of the Israelis that I wouldn't be accepting of my own government for. And I realize that, and I think about it, and I can rationalize it. Yeah, I can say the Jewish people have one homeland, everybody else has, 20 or whatever. But it's still bad and extreme behavior, but I'm not going to say it out loud, although I just did. It's probably too much. I also get that it's hard. The United States was in 2 wars, where they were great ideas or not, actually 3, if you count Vietnam, where, your enemy combatants were completely embedded into the civilian. So, I sort of, and this is a bit of an aside, but I think the notion of a civilized and surgical war is a really nice modern construct, but I think that it's completely unrealistic. And that's one of the reasons why war should be avoided and only used as an absolute last resort. But I also think it leads to the strange consequence of there being these forever wars that actually end up with much worse consequences than if you just fought to win. And, you don't declare war on a military, you declare war on a country. And this idea of we only go after the military is nice, but it's very modern. And again, if war can be avoided, that's swell. But until we figure out a way how to do that, with an ever-growing population and a scarcity of resources, I sort of have this strange thing that war should be rare, but when it's fought, it should be the Powell Doctrine. That was one of my biggest annoyances about the Iraq War, aside from the conditions we went in the Afghanistan. If you're going to go in, you go in with overwhelming force. If you're not going to go in with overwhelming force, you cannot do a war cheaply. If you're not going to go with overwhelming force, don't do it. Take your licks and go home. Or never leave. Just move on. Just say we're not doing it.
Especially when it comes to the overall areas that you are looking to get into to invade. When you are putting plans together, when you are putting the logistics together, and when you're deciding whether you should invade by air, whether you should invade by sea, whether you should invade by land, these are all very common tactics and practices that virtually anyone and everyone who's been responsible for a commanding army or who has been responsible for a national defense force has commonly used. But to expound on what you were saying, you are absolutely correct. It is a beautiful modern construct. It is an absolutely tremendous idea, but in application, will it transfer? Will it translate? No, more than likely not. Speaking and expounding upon the current war situation, I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be controversial or not. You feel free to step in and state so if you wish. But the Jewish people are, quite frankly, some of the most misunderstood and needlessly hated people on the planet, and for lack of a better term, in some way, shape, or form, always have been. I remember reading and or watching a video that was a documentary done by David Attenborough, if he was 50 years younger and had a slight lisp. But it was mentioning specifically that the Jews are the only culture of people that have been repeatedly kicked out of their homeland time and 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 time again. And since the inception formally of Israel and the recognition of statehood in the 40s, people still can't seem to get over it. People still cannot seem to just let it be. People can't seem to understand, hey, you're French, France, you were born in France, that's your homeland? Cool. Oh, hey, you were born in London, United Kingdom? Fantastic. You can go home anytime you want. But if you're Jewish and if you're born in Israel, or even if you're born in North America or Europe and you want to visit the homeland, you want to see where your culture and where your roots came from and where everything emanated from, it is going to be a lot more arduous for one to do so, and do so without scrutiny, to do so without animosity. And one of the things that my wife and I discuss from time to time, along with, social calamity and economic tension and all that, is we still can't understand the why. We understand that, for as long as human beings have been around, as long as communication has been a thing, as long as our eyes have been a thing, that we have hated things for no reason. We have disliked things for no reason. We've also loved things for no reason, and we've also appreciated things for no reason. So when it comes to the calamity that, for lack of a better term, your people have faced, I don't think very many people on the planet who are of non-Jewish descent would be capable of dealing with the amount of just sheer brutality, both physically, verbally, mentally, in written word, in video, and everything else, and still continue to move forward.
Well, I think
it speaks volumes.
I think they would be able to, because they wouldn't have a choice. I mean, there's not a choice, which is why I'm tribal, because I don't think I was ever a Zionist a day in my life until I recently realized I didn't have a choice. But in any event, I mean, I don't find what you say to be controversial, because I think that you're correct in that. But, it's like, I think the whole colonialization and decolonization has become it's become platitudes, because we're all colonizers. Everyone's a colonizer, unless you're from, South Africa and nobody ever left. That's it. Those are the only non-colonialists, or I guess the first people who got to the first places. I'm sort of going back to the alien discussion. I'm sort of waiting for the ancient reptilians to reveal themselves. So, we're all equally colonizers of their world, and we can shut up about that. But yeah, the argument as to which Canaanite tribe or tribes have a superior claim of right to this spit of land. I mean, listen, there's terrible stuff going on all over the world. Muslims against other people, Muslims against Muslims, Christians against Christians, tribe against tribe for nothing, no other reason other than that. And, nothing gets the worldwide opprobrium, as when it's Israelis fighting for Israel. I mean, that part is the disproportionate part. I mean, I find it hard to believe that the world, the youth, the Islamic youth cares more about the 2 million people in Gaza than they do about the 2 million Arabs in Israel who live with full rights and better rights than pretty much any other Arab country. Then they care more about the 2 million dead Uyghurs in China who are Muslim. They care more about the Rohingya who are Muslim, who are suffering, facing genocide in South Central Asia. That they care more about that than the Muslims being killed by Muslims in Syria and in Sudan right now, in Yemen in the civil war. Yeah, like to say, oh, it's the United States versus Iran. Well, no, there's also Yemenis against Yemenis. I mean, And it's a very tricky thing to try to compare tragedies and atrocities, and you can't really justify one by the other. And I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to point out that there's a lot of hypocrisy. And I would respect someone who said, Israel stopped the genocide. They said, Russia stopped the genocide, China stopped the genocide, Myanmar stopped the genocide, Sudan stopped it. If they, well, of course, like I think that pacifists are unrealistic, but pacifists are consistent, I will respect them every time. No matter how wrong I think they might be, I will respect them because they are pacifists across the board. War is never the answer. I mean, we have at least 6,000 or 7,000 years of proof to the contrary. But I wish everyone thought like you did, but it only takes, one, Bluto from Popeye to change the equation. That's the problem. There's you have no margin of error. It literally takes one person to think differently. But I did want to get us back to our original path a little bit. And, because we've been going an hour, it's been fascinating conversation. I hope the audience appreciates it as well. And not that many people draw that out of me. Of course, not that many guests on the show know me from before the show. We've actually known each other in different forms for, it sounds a little weird, in different forms. But we've been cyber friends in different places for probably a decade now.
Close to 10 years, yeah. About 2013, 2014.
Yeah, so and there are other guests that I've known before. And all that, but not that many. And then I have returning guests as well. That now it's a little bit different. But I do want to get back to I want to give short shrift to the actual Anunnaki in Europe. These Bavarian and Slavic stories that you promised me would be spooky and interesting. I want to get us back a little into the fun lane.
Exactly, and to expound upon your previous statement with respect to hypocrisy and how it is, we find a lot of that with respect to the original authors of various Nephilim stories. There is a song by one of my favorite bands and one of my inspirations called Hypocrisy. It's called Bug in the Net. It essentially refers to a couple driving in Lincoln, Nebraska at 10 p.m., right? They experience extraterrestrials / what they deem to be giants. And one of the lyrical forms one of the lyrical word sentences is, in 1961 at 10 p.m., the moon was 3/4 full and cruising down the road to hell. A bright light in the sky was pulsing back and forth. About a mile north of Lincoln, a light descends in front of them. Now, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with some levels of metal music and how there's a lot of references to aliens, there's a lot of references to abductions, that type of content. But if we look back at Scandinavian folklore and Scandinavian references and other things of that nature, we're constantly led to the same place. Now, when it comes to Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, their stories and their beings kind of coalesce. They kind of match at certain points. But specifically when it comes down to that particular type of explanation, that's your very basic story. But when you look back in books, when you look back in previous examples of text, the European descendants of the Anunnaki or the Nephilim, more often than not, were just general giant individuals in the sense that they were more than likely anywhere between 6'5" to 7'5". There isn't a lot of, for lack of a better term, verifiable evidence as to exactly what and or where they were first identified in southeast Germany.
Can I pause here and just make what is probably an obvious point? Because a lot of times when I speak to people who are talking about the giants and they talk about, it's people that are 6'5", 7'5", very tall, like they'd be tall, but, basketball offensive lineman tall. But they often say, well, if you were an Inca, there was, your average man was 5'2", or if you were 5'4", European, and you came across a 6'4", Viking, you would think they were a giant. Well, you're talking about the countries from whence the Vikings came. So they wouldn't be confused between a oversized person and just a big Viking, because they'd be people in their towns that were big Vikings. So that's the only point I wanted to make.
Well, you're familiar, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Ishtar and Enlil, right?
Yep.
The god of air who was separated between heaven and earth. There's a lot of differences in between, and I'm looking through some of my notes here. There's differences between the ancient Hittites and the ancient Hurricanes, to where Germans and Belgians, for whatever reason, seem to feel that is it Ishtar? Yeah, they feel that Ishtar did not in any way, shape, or form exist. That this is literally just an addition onto an addition of a story for ancillary purposes. But when we look at Shamash, and in various treaties that were invoked as secrets were kept and other witnesses were laid bare and so on, there are a lot of places in southeastern Germany where if you go to even just countrysides, if you go to, let's just say, I'm not going to say farmers' fields, but barren land, just giant land that nobody is using. There are not Nazca lines, but there are isolated incidents of very, very bizarre and peculiar visual representation, like you were saying before about the Nazca lines. There are some crop circles, or whatever term you want to use, whether it be North American, whether it be European, whether it be Asian, so on and so forth. There are still mysteries in a lot of different areas, and a lot of scholars, especially at the University of Munster, who are looking into trying to understand exactly, one, why there's a lot of origin, and why there's a lot of bizarre behavior and or visual things within the area, but they're also trying to put forth an archaeological dig. So in a lot of areas of Munich, Leipzig, some parts of Frankfurt on Main, not entirely, but there are a lot of places in that southeastern section to where they feel very strongly that there are a lot of skeletonized remains, that they feel that there are artifacts that may or may not open the door to understanding a little bit more as to whether or not the Anunnaki was a direct slave race or whether or not they were trying to create it. But in that particular study, there was let's just see, no. They were initially associated with the heavens and with the literary and administrative texts with an increased role for them in earthly affairs. So we were discussing the Tower of Babel, right? How ultimately, is that a story? Did that actually happen? We're not really entirely sure, and no one can be sure. But in the association with the heavens as well as the earth in the Sumerian text, and trying to reference the chief Babylonian god Marduk, I'm probably butchering that. I'm sorry, Babylonians, my bad. But there is an absolute discourse and complete and utter chaos, pardon the pun, with how people feel, what people believe, what people are trying to really put together. And for people like you and me who are absolutely addicted to content like this, when it comes to, again, ancient aliens, when it comes to spooky stuff, and when it comes to boogeymans and all that, we want more. We want to see more. We want to understand where things originally emanated from. Would it be nice to have a true and objective and a fully partial source? Yeah, absolutely. It would be fantastic, but the world doesn't work like that, and unfortunately humans don't work like that. But when we go into the idea of the Sumerian myth and to the descent of Inanna into the underworld, there's a lot of origin that comes directly from, I'm going to say, like, not Munich directly, but a lot of areas in and or around Munich that, to be fair, I feel are the origins behind the story of the descent of Inanna into the underworld. But when we take into account the translated texts between that and putting it into either Arabic, English, French, what have you, there's naturally going to be a couple of small differences. There's going to be maybe some miscommunications or maybe some errors in language, but overall, the idea is that the German contingent of this writer/writers were trying to put forth that the overthrowing process of Inanna was because the individual was too audacious. Now, is that not something that happens a lot in German culture? Yes, it absolutely is. People, everything runs so smoothly and so perfectly with respect to public transportation and logistics and all of that, that you really have a hard time understanding why people aren't able to come to a common consensus on one particular thing, especially if that particular individual wrote the story. But evidently they did not. What are some of your thoughts there?
I actually want to hear the Inanna story origin that you're referring to.
Well, the Inanna story origin, to be as succinct as I possibly can about it, because I'm not even sure I have all the facts, but it details way back in the 40s and 50s when people were starting to really fully discover and starting to fully write about these things and be able to actually write about them publicly rather than have to write about them in secret and keep them in a drawer, for lack of a better term. So there was no persecution with that, but the origin is such that in the 1940s, 1950s, the descent into the underworld was a story that was created and or fabricated in ancient times in what is currently considered either modern-day Leipzig or modern-day Fulgursen. So it doesn't really currently have any sort of translation to that directly, but the origin of it specifically, just try to compartmentalize my thoughts here. When those people were writing in the 40s and 50s about the original origin of the story, their texts that they were extrapolating information from were not even in German.
Right.
They were not even in English. They were in Arabic or they were in Pinyin. Or sorry, not Pinyin. I am absolutely butchering the name of this language. It is an Arabic subsect that I cannot remember the name of right now. But these texts were translated incorrectly. When they translated them into German and when they started expounding upon them and creating their own stories, and when they started tying it to the underworld, the specific underworld story that we're discussing here, it became lost in translation. So now about 50% of the Inanna's descent into the underworld stories that you see now are erroneous, and they're not even from the original text.
Right, and that makes total sense in that, I mean, I don't know if it's right or wrong, obviously, and we'll probably never find out, but it makes sense. Yeah, she goes through 7 gates. I mean, 7, yeah, you can say it's universal, but it's also very Christian, but it is also universal. And, you know, people have explained to me why. Some say it's the phases of the moon, but that's not exactly right. Others say it's because of the 7 wanderers, the heavenly bodies that people could see that move differently than the stars. But why they stopped at 7, you know, when, you know, at some point, yeah, obviously some people could see, Uranus and Neptune. I mean, so, you know, I'm not sure. And that sort of, but those folks will say, well, that's why they created more gods and added more gods into the pantheons, is as they saw more of the of the wanderers, so to speak. But
well,
yeah,
you're familiar with the epics of Gilgamesh, right? Where in that particular story, that they view the Anunnaki as being judges or litigators of the dead. Right. So a completely separate entity in that, you have a different fundamental understanding, belief system, ideology in one epic, in one story, and then in another, their position, their place, so to speak, is completely different. So when we're talking about that one story, that descent into the underworld, and how so many, it's basically like a literary game of telephone. Right? So many different people have tried to write about it that literally almost everything you see about it is completely inaccurate.
I call it language drift. Language drift creates story drift. And sometimes story drift might create language drift as well. But the funny thing is that, I mean, Gilgamesh is a demigod. He's 2/3 divine and 1/3 magic. I mean, you know, whether that's magic or there was a priestess, you know, in the line there. And basically, his best friend is a hybrid creature that's made by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh in Enkidu. You know, they become, you know, like, you know, best buddies. Some people say lovers. I think that's a bit of a reach given the story. But then again, maybe what's unspoken. I don't care. But basically, a beast man created by the gods, a challenge. Which, I mean, what's a beast man other than a hybrid? I don't think they meant a particularly hairy Greek man when they came up with that. So so that is fascinating. And you know, I understand that part of the issue with sort of the European and John F. White from Craigenford actually, he made this crystal clear, and I've already recorded a show with him, and then I'll air it in the new year. I don't know if it'll be before or after the show, who knows. I always have 6 or 7 extra shows in the can. Well, have
you heard of the German Anunnaki board game?
No, tell me about it.
Okay, so
let me just finish what John told me. John said the reason why you don't know a lot about Russian and Slavic folklore and myths and creation and their gods is that none of it was written. It's all oral. So, it gets overcome by the ones that are written. It gets overcome by the victors who try to incorporate it or erase it. And all sorts of things happen. And that's why John F. White, one of the premier authorities on Indo-European mythology, can't give you a straight story on Slavic and Russian creation stories because we don't know it.
That and each of the Anunnaki were not worshipped collectively; they were all worshipped individually. Essentially, cult-like status. It's just, oh my God, this is going to be an absolutely horrible comparison, and I apologize to the listeners, but it's essentially Genesis and how everybody liked, I like Phil Collins, or no, I like Peter Gabriel, or like.
Well, you said Genesis and you went to that Genesis, you threw me off. Well, at least there's not going to be a Mike and the Mechanics crowd. But yeah, no, I have often thought that when you actually look at the Anunnaki, you look at the premier god in each pantheon when they were all, where gods were from places. I mean, one of the things I learned recently, and I listened to the great courses also, which I count as books. One of the lecturers said that one of the things about Judaism that made it so transcendental is that your God no longer was necessarily tied to a place. You could worship your God anywhere, which of course had to do with writing and that might be, by the way, that might be the origin of why people never liked Jews, because always a very literate people, that was always, it was like part of the Torah study and it was writing. So there was so much literacy that obviously you got into, higher level jobs, even if you weren't like you were at least at an administrative level. So it was basically always the smarty pantses. So that kind of resentment, grows over, centuries and millennia. But anyway, I digress on that. But yeah, I've always thought that there's a possibility that all of the different gods were sort of like mayors or governors of a region, and that there was a council. Now, I spoke to Professor Michael York, who told me, he's like, no, you're wrong. He's like, Marduk is Deus, and he is Indra. He is Zeus. He is Thor. They're the same. They're the same god. They're the same person. It's just a different name, and certain aspects change and to fit with, if you want fish or it's cold, it's going to be different than if you need rain and you're in an arid climate. But aside from that, it's the same, which is, that's fine. But it's not as fun as the, sort of the Anunnaki Council of Governors or the, the intergalactic, Senate. We have representation without voting rights.
And that's entirely true. I couldn't have said it any better myself, especially when you likened it to mayors and governorship. I love that comparison so much, because in the ancient world, I mean, night and day compared to what it is like now. We don't have to hunt, we don't have to forage, we don't have to live the daily life that we had 2,000 of years ago in order to survive. But, getting back to what you were stating before, you wanted to really, really get into like the German boogie, like, some of the spooky folklore and some of that stuff. Are you familiar with the Nachtseher?
Even if I am, certainly not the proper pronunciation. So just assume I'm not familiar.
So just to give you some context, this beast is known as the After Eater. So for context, I wrote down like a little thing here. Basically, prominent in old folklore, it comes to life after being dead and is a hybrid between a vampire and a ghoul. So for Fallout fans, you're going to be very excited. But usually a Nachtseher is created when a person dies due to unnatural causes. So if somebody's murdered, if somebody jumps in front of a train and it's not their time to jump on the train, all that kind of stuff. that's when that particular entity comes into creation, or when it comes into ideology. It doesn't suck the blood, so it's not a vampire. Merely just yum, 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 yum. It devours bodies like Cookie Monster, for lack of a better term. This is one that has been likened to, I cannot remember the specific name of the giant, but it's been likened to one of the earlier Nephilims, in the sense that this particular entity was neither living nor dead, nor was it physical. It was considered to be a spiritual construct, but one that entities and or individuals or humans or whatever could communicate with. That, clearly you don't want to be on the wrong side of the damn thing, because I don't know anybody who wants to be devoured in any other way. That's really, really bad. But there's also another example of German boogeymen, so to speak, known as the Earth. So the Earth Hen, basically kind of like a banshee, in that it prophesizes when death is close. So, you have a scary situation. Mom and kid are walking down the street, blah, 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 blah. Mom's pushing a stroller, kid's holding a balloon or some shit. Oh no, I lost my balloon, went out into traffic. This banshee's gonna come up and let you know, hey, get it back on that sidewalk. Get back on that sidewalk and you watch your child, man. How dare you? But for lack of a better term, that's essentially what that is. It doesn't, let's see.
But you can change your fortunes.
In front of someone or behind someone as well.
If you listen to it, though, it sounds like you can change your fortunes. It's not like that hitchhiker from the Twilight Zone where you're already dead.
No, you actually have, at least according to this lore, you have a choice. When presented with said scream or said vocalization, you're not imminently dead.
Right.
You have a split-second decision to either choose between life and death.
Well, that's hopeful.
And regardless of which one you choose, this one will go with you. So if you choose to live, it stays with you in spirit. If you choose to die, or if you die, it will follow your soul.
Right.
Which is also a very, very lovely example. We know of Krampus, I'm fairly sure. I am pretty sure you're familiar with the Krampus lore.
Yeah, we did one of our Christmas shows, spent a lot of time on Krampus.
Well, Krampus is a very beautiful man, and I think he's very, very misunderstood, but that's also because I have a very strong affinity for the ugly and for the grotesque and for the macabre and for everything else like that in life. But let's get into Rubazal.
Of course.
Do you know my friend Rubazal over there now?
No, but I could never solve his cube, that puzzle.
Yes. Well, we're still trying to figure that one out over here, but as long as we're not taking the stickers and putting them on the right sides, I think we're doing kind of okay.
That's a very Captain Kirk, Kobayashi Maru method.
Well, hey, William Shatner's still alive. I got to pay tribute to him somehow, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But the Rubazal is essentially a mountain spirit. So when we look at, let's just say, for example, Chinese folklore and Chinese mythology, there is a lot of there's a lot of precedence put to strong storytelling. There's a lot of precedence put to tangible lessons that one can learn. And also my wife is in the room, so she can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. But when it comes down to the differences between folklore and actual event storytelling, there aren't that many differences between Indo-European, Asian, and, for lack of a better term, North American storytelling. There are similarities across all the boards, but there's still not as much of a precedent to have that story do something, have it mean something tangible the way it does in most Asian countries and most European countries. Please don't take this the wrong way. I love America, but a lot of the media in the United States is more focused on selling a point. It's not focused on trying to give you information. So with this mountain spirit, for those that are thought to be bad or outright evil, it corrupts your mind so that you are not capable of doing good or even trying to do good, that you will just perpetually fall into further and further holes. Essentially, to quote, Rubazal is the fantastic lord of weather of the mountains. He is known throughout the lands for his wayward character, and he might send lightning and thunder, fog, rain, or snow from the mountains if he chooses to do so. But be warned, if your soul is less than good or charitable, you will be haunted for eternity by this entity, and whom will make you regret every decision that you make. So, getting into that, there's a lot of commonalities between that and English folklore when it comes to not the Loch Ness Monster, but all of the crazy, like, spooky Slenderman-esque type of characters that they have introduced throughout the time. Jack the Ripper sort of thing. I mean, without the murder, stabby stab, but the idea that this entity essentially is further compounding your calamity is absolutely beautiful in a way. Right. So, there's a lot of comparisons between that and current day folklore.
He's like Zeus and Loki in one.
Yes! Exactly like that. Literally nailed it. And when you were talking about mermen and, essentially like water creatures earlier. I'm not familiar if you're familiar with the band Deathclock, but Deathclock is essentially a very, very heavy metal band fronted by a actor, director, writer, producer by the name of Brendan Small. He had a TV show on Adult Swim for 5 years between 1999 and 2004 called Home Movies. They released 52 episodes, and Deathclock was on from, I believe, 2006 to 2013, and they have a lot of episodes as well. But the point I'm getting at here is they have a song called Mermaider, where the story is that the protagonist is going into the go forth into the deep so you can touch water, so you can swallow your mind. He goes into the water, and he sees this beast of burden. He sees that this entity, this creature, is monolithic, but he must take it out. That song is directly taken from a couple of different German and Finnish folklore that was made beautifully into a song, and I highly recommend everybody listen to it. But overall, the mountain spirit ideology is very similar in that respect with the German folklore. Kind of, you've made your own bed, now you have to lie in it.
Well, that is, there's a lesson in that. By the way, that song, that can be the outro if you want to send it to me, unless you want to send me one of yours, which is fine as well. You can think about it.
Send you one of mine, or if you have like the YouTube or Spotify or anything else like that, you can just literally just pick one. I would have some level of recommendation with respect to this particular episode. Path to Babylon might be a good one.
Sounds good.
It is a trap song, so I'm not entirely certain as to whether or not that would flow with your listenership. But
it's the outro. At that point, they're stuck, right?
Yeah. You know what? Path to Babylon's probably a good one.
Path to Babylon. And for those of you who haven't figured it out yet, one of the cleric's many talents is that the cleric is a musician.
And there was no actual drum roll there. I was just trying to lighten up the compliment there, because I'm not very good at taking these types of things. But yes, with respect to my professional vocation, recording art as well as visualizations, video pieces, things of that nature, and all elements of entertainment and performance, for lack of a better term. But getting back to what we were stating with the mountain spirit, there's one more I want to mention before we start to taper off here, and that is known as the Wilde Jagd, so the wild hunt. A lot of different lakes surrounding the wild hunt, and in most of them, the hunter is leading the group. Now, this particular folklore piece, it isn't one entity, it is more or less an ideology. Mm-hmm. More or less, and I can see from your nodding that you're somewhat familiar with this one too. It's a very, very unique / not very ubiquitously seen kind of way to understand that if a person stands up against hunters, he undoubtedly will be punished. So it's basically one way of saying, stand up for yourself, do not become the huntee, you must be in the wild hunt in order to survive.
Yeah. The wild hunt is one of those stories that nobody is exactly sure where it originated from and how old it is. And the interesting thing is that the story may actually be older than humans domesticating horses, but horses play a role in it, or at least horse-like beasts, but so do wolves or hunting dogs. But, I mean, humans and wolves / dogs have had a relationship at least 100,000 years. So that part's not unusual at all, but the horse part, I mean, unless archaeology and anthropology is really, really wrong, which is entirely possible. The story might be not just millennium, but tens of millennium earlier than the domestication of horses, which apparently, according to, I think, current wisdom or consensus, is around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, somewhere between 5 and 6,000 BC, or 4 and 7,000 BC, depending on who you listen to, and of course who you believe in who invented the chariots. Although chariots predate horses, they were originally just led by goats, and then later donkeys and and mules. So you could interbreed before you could break the horse. I mean, there was a relationship with horses, just not riding them. They were meat.
Yes, and a very, very plentiful source of it. But even in common situations in Europe, they are still utilized for meat purposes. But you find that, especially in today's culture and in today's society, there's a lot of I think in English the term is virtue signaling, where, things that were okay like 100, 200, 300 years ago, not dealing specifically with racism or anything like that here, but, oh, how dare you eat cows? Oh, the poor babies. It's just like, yo, my boy, I get it, you're a vegan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you speak for all cows. What if the cow wanted to be eaten? You don't know. So, even in that context, in that perspective, there's still a lot, and I mean a lot of issues that come across when, you're faced with scenarios like that.
Well, the cows were, I mean, listen, I'm not going to try to justify giant farming and all of that and the cruelty. I'm well aware of that, and this is one of these things that I can't do anything about and probably wouldn't anyway. But when the cows were in the state of nature, I mean, they were being hunted by wolves and bears and cougars and lions and tigers and people too. Those deaths were probably more painful than the bolt to the back of the head. Again, I'm not commenting on the quality of the life and what they're fed on and all of that. That those are entirely different shows and probably hosted by networks with reporters and resources that are beyond our means here. But this has been a fascinating conversation. You're welcome back anytime. We could probably talk forever, I have a feeling. And the only downside to it is that you get too much out of me. And the funny thing about this show is that it's generally not based around me. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. But all right, so folks, you got a little bit more about my politics and stuff like that in here. And I guess it's just a matter of time. But at least it was from an old friend, Cleric of Chaos, coming to us from Germania. Are you a Bavarian, Prussian, Teutonic? I mean, we're
Bavarian. So a lot of my roots emanate specifically from Leipzig and Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
But as you did so accurately call out in the beginning, I am Canadian by birth, which is very unfortunate, at least to me personally, as I have very strong feelings with respect to how this country is organized and or run, but that's a topic for another day.
Sure.
But overall, a lot of my family emanates from the southeastern section and like the central eastern section of Germany. There's also on my mother's side, my biological mother's side, there's a lot of French, which is amazing. Apparently, there were colonists here, a part of my bloodline, both German as well as French, going back as far as 1641, apparently. So, hooray, whether that's good or bad, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
But as you mentioned, this discussion has been absolutely amazing. I sent you via Twitter message the link for the song.
Perfect.
And realistically, thank you for helping me out with that beta test and for coming on and having the discussion that we did there. You are absolutely more than welcome to come back anytime that you would like as well. And we are going to be continuing that probably throughout the new year. But outside of that,
I have to now.
For the time we spent today. What's that?
I have to now. It never aired. I mean, my ego can't allow it to be. Like what's that match that nobody can find? The Bret Hart versus some guy match that nobody can find.
Bret Hart versus Tom McGee.
Yeah, right. It can't be that. It can't be this lost cuts. So I need to be heard. So
I'm definitely going to do a do-over on that with you. We'll organize and coordinate that at some point in the new year as well. But as to thank you very directly and from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity to speak with you very cordially and very let's just say, humorously, for lack of a better term, about a topic that we both really, really like and that we really enjoy. For any and all listeners who may or may not be interested in pursuing any items, of course, with respect to the Cleric of Chaos, I have a link tree that is attached to my Twitter. I'm also on all forms of social media. Me personally, I am not on social media. I do not possess any, but the Cleric, as you well know, does indeed. So moving forward, we are very grateful for the time that we spent with you today, and we look forward to returning if the time permits.
The time will always permit. There's always content creators always need content, and you know that too. So, all right, wonderful. So, folks, you got a taste of the Cleric of Chaos. Certainly look for that show to come out. If for nothing else, that I'll be on it. Yay! And we thank you for listening and supporting all of our guests. And give us a nice little rating, a review, a share, a referral, and more than anything else, listen to us next week in the Garden of Doom.